Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to another episode of Voices for Excellence. I am your host, Dr. Michael Conner, CEO and founder of the Agile Evolutionary Group, and of course, the proud host of VFE. And today's guest, I met Alex, I would say roughly about 8 months ago. It was in New York City, and we were talking about AI in education. And Alex, I would say, gave one of the most descriptive presentations on generative AI, even down to the geek level of what I love around explaining how the LLMs, large language models, are being developed in that conglomerate within the data. Everybody knows how I am, but it is just an absolute honor to have Alex Kotran on Voices for Excellence. Alex is the CEO and founder of aiEDU. Now, aiEDU has been taking off across the country, specifically in the education ecosystem, focused on how we can include or incorporate AI in education. We're seeing Alex all across the country. His work has been lamented in Ohio, New York City, just going back and forth all over. And it's just an absolute honor to have Alex. We're going to have a really in-depth, I did this on purpose to bring Alex on VFE, because we're going to have a really in-depth conversation about AI in education. And we have one of the national czars and experts on VFE. So it is my honor, I should say, to have Alex Kotran, the CEO and founder of aiEDU, on VFE. Alex, from San Francisco, California. Welcome. How are you, my friend?
Thanks so much. I'm great. Yeah, it's been the school year is coming to a close, and most kids are done. Not everybody, but most. Which means now administrators are, most people don't realize this, but school does not end for principals and superintendents ever, really. And so now they're starting to shift and thinking about next year. And so we're already in those conversations. It's like, well, talking about the 24-25 school year.
Absolutely, absolutely. I remember, those days of being a principal, being assistant superintendent, chief academic officer, superintendent. I always used to say the worst time of the academic year is always the end of the academic year, summer planning, because you're planning for the 24-25 or that next year, as well as summer activities and summer programming, and the initial beginning stages of the year. One of the three periods that are very, very tough for educators, but I'm glad that you're involved in the conversation, because that means that leaders are thinking about how to incorporate AI, generative models, emergent technologies into their organizational strategy. But we're going to unpack that, Alex. Can't wait to have a quote unquote geek out session with you. But first, we're going to start the podcast off with a fun question, Alex. And as the CEO and founder of the AI Education Project, aiEDU, as we stated, and a renowned voice within the thread of the ecosystem focused on artificial intelligence, what excellent song describes your work with educators across the country?
What song about excellence?
Or what song, like a general song that describes your work? I always like to say excellence or equity work, but what's your excellence work that describes, or I should say, the excellence work that describes you and your leadership with educators across the country? And it could be any song, Alex.
Oh man, I have a pretty broad range of music tastes. The song that I was sharing around the beginning of this year was New York State of Mind by Nas. And that was right after we signed our partnership with New York City Public Schools. And it's funny, you did send me some questions. I didn't get the chance to read through any of them, so I didn't come prepared. But the song really fits. I mean, really, our obsession with place and community has, I think, really differentiated us and also helped distill for people what it is that they're supposed to do in this moment. Because I think, there's everybody, especially if you're listening to this podcast, everybody's talked about AI. They've had the conversation. They some people are skeptics. Some people are, perhaps maybe too optimistic about, what the possibilities are. But, we're having those conversations. People are hearing that this is going to change the world. And the question is like, well, what am I supposed to do about it? And in many cases, it's not really obvious. And to me, the one thing that is obvious is, this work has to happen at the very ground level. Teachers, school leaders, building leaders, system leaders need to be not just at the table. Everybody says, "Oh, we need to include teachers at the center of the design," and that we do need to do that. But the harder thing that we also need to do is we need to empower them and
Hmm.
make sure that they're informed. Because just being at the table isn't that useful if you're not an informed participant in the conversation. And to do that, you have to go local. You can't boil the ocean. Um, New York City was the first city that I ever visited. Being in Ohio, I grew up in Akron, 400,000 people. Um, I was that Midwestern kid who dreamed of the big city. And New York was the first city. I was like with a band. We took a bus there. And I still remember, going out of the Holland Tunnel. Um, and, I've had sort of this personal fascination with the scope and scale and diversity and, eccentricities that New York has to offer. And so, yeah, I'm super excited that we're getting the chance to actually, you know, demonstrate a model in the biggest district in the country.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Alex, when you say New York state of mind, I'm here in New York, not New York City, but New York State. And absolutely, we're always in a New York state of mind. But I love what you said about moving, I like to say moving the thread or moving that needle where now we're empowering and informing our educators. Empowering and informing our educators with regards to how to concretize artificial intelligence and practices so that now we're creating, I like to say, that intentional interface with AI and being able to drive specific elements within our operating model, which is so important. But, your work with aiEDU or the AI Education Project, it started in 2019, Alex. Now, listen, I want my audience to really think about this, right? And obviously, there was work leading up to 2019, but you were thinking about AI in education. You were thinking about how technology was going to revolutionize the traditional operating model. This was before the pandemic and the conclusion of the BC stage of education, which I call before COVID-19. Now, this compelling vision that you had about AI in education at that time, what were the origins of that? Did you forecast that AI was going to revolutionize the model, that artificial intelligence was going to be a core lever in the future of education? So, when you started thinking about this, right, how did you start coming to realize that AI was going to be a foundational piece moving forward? And then also, too, what is the work that is needed to interface AI within a traditional model for the students that we're educating today, which are Generation Z and Generation Alpha?
We were in the t-shirt before the band was cool. And without going into like my entire life story, I'm a millennial. So, I grew up before cell phones. I remember the first time I got a cell phone. I watched the world change with the internet and with social media. And so, I think there's just sort of a general sense that I was attuned to the sense of like technology can be, utterly transformational. I was working in politics, like, grassroots organizing. I worked for the Obama re-elect, worked for Department of Health doing like Affordable Care Act outreach. Um, and so so that was really where I got this sort of like grassroots. Uh, that's where I cut my teeth in grassroots. And so I was in DC working in politics, and all my colleagues were moving to all my friends from the administration were moving to San Francisco, and that was because we had watched. This was a period where the biggest companies in the world were now technology companies, internet companies.
Mhm.
And so that was what brought me out west. Worked for a number of different companies you've heard of, but then my big break was I had been volunteering. This is a testament to why you should always pay it forward, because you never know what might come from that. But I was volunteering for this nonprofit doing comms work, and it was a think tank that had just sort of spun out, a student group that had turned into a independent think tank, a Harvard student group that had created an independent think tank focused on AI governance. helping them out with AI stuff, and impressed one of their funders who basically invited me to go and work for his company. Sort of a quasi family office role. I was basically charged with standing up a corporate social responsibility strategy around AI ethics. Um, and so this was a company called H5. Nobody's heard of H5, but they were the first company ever to build language models for the legal sector. And so they were very hyper specialized, worked with, the biggest law firms in the world, on high stakes litigation discovery for those who, um, know the jargon. Um, and and so I started out basically building. Well, the first question is, how do you even move the needle in AI ethics? Because there were a handful of organizations that were trying to figure this out, and they were, focused on publishing principles and, educating policymakers. But, it's, especially if you're a small company, it's hard to actually have an impact in those spaces. So we honed in on education. We decided, okay, let's actually build an AI 101 program for judges and legal practitioners to specifically address instances where I mean, we call it AI, it was just algorithms at the time, but where
Yeah.
where AI tools and algorithms were being used in the carriage of justice, where there wasn't just the possibility of disparate outcomes and bias, but there were like multiple demonstrated instances where these tools were having, bad impacts with specific groups of people. So that's what we ended up doing. We built an AI education program for judges, worked with NYU Law and the UN and Stanford and a bunch of others. And so, as you've noticed at this point in the story, I at no point ever worked as an educator. He would ask me back then, "Oh, are you interested in education?" That was not in my plan. I thought, "Oh, maybe go work for AI," or I was interested in the climate. But my mom is a math teacher. She's taught at Akron Public Schools for 30 years. Last year, she's about to retire. They were definitely trying to convince me to go to law school or get a master's or just do something. And because they didn't understand what I was doing at this, small AI company, they certainly didn't know what AI was. I was telling my mom about this training that we had just done at NYU, and I was like, you should have seen the looks on these judges' faces as they were learning about this. And she remarked offhand, she said, "Oh, you should come to my school and do a presentation for my kids. They should learn about AI." And it was like this. It actually was the light bulb moment, not in the sense that like, oh, I need to start an organization to address that, but it was more like this. Holy crap! Like the I was attending all the AI conferences all over the world, in San Francisco and Paris and Dubai and London. And every time the experts the people at the very forefront, the companies that are now the most valuable companies in the world, their experts were coming and saying, this technology is going to, radically disrupt like career pathways, the world of work. At the time we were mostly worried about truck drivers and, taxi drivers, and I don't think they necessarily were foretelling knowledge work, but we'll get to that. But the part of the reason that for this profound moment is that I just also attended some I think it was like a virtual panel or something, but basically Brookings had just published a study that identified like the top 20 cities in the US that were most at risk for automation that would be accelerated by AI. And Akron, where I grew up, is number 19 on that list. And so it was like the juxtaposition of that, of like, okay, this is a city that literally is on the list of like, it's right in the crosshairs. And all these experts and smart people are, like ringing the alarm that this is happening. This is a real thing. Machine learning, deep learning even had reached, technological maturity in like 2015, 2016, 2017, which is about that time. So this was way beyond just sort of like a hypothetical, like companies were actually deploying this. And so that seemed like a really big disconnect. If anybody should be talking about the future of work, it's with these kids who are literally deciding what am I going to do with my future? What is the work? What are the careers that are going to lead me to prosperity? And it seemed just completely insane that we weren't having a conversation that I had been having now quite regularly, which is like, actually, there are some really bad decisions that you can make, and if you're going to become a truck driver, you should have a plan. Like, maybe you also learn mechanics so that you can, like there's a relatively straightforward conversation you need to have with kids. So that was really the nexus of all this. I just got obsessed with it. How do we actually make sure that, the next generation is a part of this conversation about AI? Um, and and yeah, we'll talk more about sort of our theory of change and all that. But I wish I could say I called it. I called it. I figured in my lifetime this would happen. My thought was, we'd spend the 2020s building infrastructure quietly, getting ready for this big moment, maybe in the 2030s. I did not predict that in 2022, ChatGPT would become the fastest growing app in history, and suddenly millions of people would have access to, more powerful models than, university AI labs had at the time.
Yeah.
Your other question was about implementation of the tools to support learning. And just to repeat, I just want to make sure that
Yeah. So, I mean, you pretty much answered the question about Generation Z, Generation Alpha around challenging the traditional models, the traditional nodes. Really loved how you expanded upon the world of work. Yeah, please continue, Alex.
um, so I think this is really important. So we can nerd out about how is AI going to transform teaching and learning,
Hmm.
and we should spend some time talking about that.
Oh, yeah.
Language models, and it may not just be LLMs, but certainly LLMs have some unique applications that are incredibly promising for tutoring and coaching and um, teacher support and enhancing the quality of instruction and automating some of the most mundane aspects of teachers' jobs. Helping to address really big gaps in educational access for students with disabilities, for the neurodiverse community. AI is going to be nothing short of transformational, especially for the most marginalized kids. So
Absolutely.
there's this interesting tension where, because we're also going to talk about AI is going to have some really disparate impacts, negative impacts with perhaps even those same communities when we think about career pathways and opportunity. And so there's a balance there. But so there's a lot to be said about AI in education, but the bigger, I think we're missing the forest for the trees when we start talking about the tools in the classroom, because yes, AI is going to be integrated across the education. I think it's going to take longer than certainly the startup founders.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Probably talking more like 5 to 10 years, not 2 to 3.
Hmm.
Just knowing how this works, firsthand.
Yeah,
But it is also the case that AI is going to be integrated into every other aspect of work,
absolutely.
especially knowledge work, especially the most common career pathways into knowledge work. Like if you look at all the
Absolutely.
research right now is suggesting that like these are the jobs where, maybe half of the daily tasks either can already be replaced by LLM, large language models, or are likely to be replaced in, let's say, the next 5 years, which is a
Hmm.
blink of an eye. If you're a freshman in high school, that's like 1 year into your first job, right? So that list includes software engineers, data scientists, mathematicians,
Hmm.
paralegals, designers,
Hmm.
writers, marketers, financial analysts, accountants, doctors, lawyers.
Yes.
Like this is a
Everything.
really big deal, and all the tools in the world are not going to address that.
Right.
Addressing
Right.
that challenge is actually a human capital challenge. It's how do you steer these massive tanker ships through like these tumultuous waters, and we don't even know where we're going. Like we know enough to say that a lot of jobs are going to change, maybe disappear. If you're really optimistic, you'll say, and there'll be new jobs created. Nobody knows those jobs are. Um,
Right.
so that needs to be the top conversation, because if we don't move urgently to address it, I think people are going to be surprised by how fast these tools are going to be implemented because, like generally speaking, companies invest in automation when they need to cut costs.
Correct.
It's been a while since companies have had to truly cut costs. I mean, we haven't had a recession since, notwithstanding the blip in COVID, we haven't had a real extended recession since 2007.
Yeah.
So we haven't been in a world where companies are, not just interested in these tools from the perspective of, oh, like, innovation and, differentiating ourselves. We're going to eventually, at some point or another, be in a place where companies have a urgent need to figure this stuff out. And so my worry is that actually this could happen not gradually, but rather all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Um, I think we need to really get ahead of that.
Absolutely. And a profound response, Alex, because I want to highlight your work when you were working for the Obama administration. And when you were working for the Obama administration, I always say that was the precipice point where essentially AI was introduced holistically. I always say that was kind of like that time where Generation Z, the digital natives, and then Generation Alpha following Generation Z, who are called we call them the generative natives with that. But I really loved how you said we have to move urgently. And as you talk about automation, right? Some aspects of or different elements within various industries becoming automated. And I think you referenced the same study that I read too. It was the Oxford study. Around 47% of jobs are going to be automated by 2035. But when you talk about human capital, I really want to expand on this, right? Human capital to social capital, Alex. When we talk about social capital or the shared mental model around what the world of work or the future of work is going to look like, how do we truly now, and I loved how you stated to move away from just isolated applications or different AI tools. And I think that's what's been, a lot of the conversation going around AI and education, specifically in schools. But when we talk about truly reimagining the model, when we talk about truly this transformative learning experience for our students that incorporates, developing skills and then also developing AI competencies, because now we're starting to see a shift of knowledge work decrease because of this level of automation within the economy. Moving beyond these, I like to say, silo tools that we talk about, how do we now move to this macro discussion of changing the whole education model so that there's that level of coherence with AI and various emerging technologies and LMs and LLMs strategically, or machine learning being strategically incorporated so we are preparing our students for the future and the world of work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's less about, I don't think it's about reimagining or reinventing education. I think,
Mm-hmm.
in fact, the most important indicator of success for a student is probably not even AI literacy, um,
Mm-hmm.
but rather it's the other durable skills that will help them differentiate from AI tools in work. And so those are
Yeah,
like critical thinking, computational thinking,
yeah,
communication,
yeah,
collaboration. So none of that's new. We don't need, I mean, like aiEDU does not take credit for being, for saying that we need to focus on creating engaging learning experiences for kids. But that is what we need to do. I mean, we need to make learning more engaging. We need to actually uh, uh, do a much better job of integrating project-based learning. You know, so the challenge is less about reinventing education. There is maybe some reinvention to be done in terms of the systems, though, because the challenge now is that most teachers in the U.S. are not incentivized around critical thinking. They're not measured, and there isn't necessarily even standards. So we're not even evaluating whether or not students are successful. The standards that we're using right now to evaluate whether they're successful are missing some important components. I also believe, computer science, writing, math, like those are also not going away. I think people who say kids don't need to learn computer science anymore just, I think that's a very pessimistic
Yeah.
perspective. Because sure, I mean, maybe no, maybe we don't need to learn anything, but you know, I don't use math in my day-to-day work, and yet I can't imagine that I'd be successful if I hadn't built the sort of even just the resilience of learning and struggling through math class was my least favorite subject, but it's a good thing that I was forced to struggle through that. Um, and so, anyways, I think very much this is like back to basics and figuring out how do we actually create the conditions for schools to be able to do that. Because the thing is, you talk to teachers, and it's not like, oh, I've never thought of trying to do more project-based learning. It's
Hmm.
that, I have less time than I had 2 years ago because we're short, two teachers in my department.
Yeah.
And I'm dealing with all this other stuff, and we have standards, and I'm already working, after hours without getting paid overtime, grading papers, and now you're coming to tell me that I need to like create new curriculum and revise everything that I'm doing. Like where, like, so the teachers would like to do it, they just don't have the capacity. Um, the school leaders feel like their hands are tied because at the end of the day, a superintendent is can be very impactful in some domains, but they don't decide what the state and that the state standards are.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that's really one big challenge is like how do we align the ed leaders in the ecosystem to start identifying what are the ways to start unblocking this.
Yeah.
Um, the other thing that is just to respond, I mean, back in 2019 when we were started, we talked a lot about AI literacy, and now we talk more about AI readiness, and
Yeah.
that might sound semantic, but AI literacy is really like what are the knowledge and skills to use and interact with AI effectively and safely. Um, I think now we've seen enough to know that AI literacy is going to be intuitive. Like it'll just
Mhm.
it's not going to be it's like talking about mobile phone literacy. Like people are just going to figure this stuff out because it's going to be ubiquitous. It's going to be seamlessly integrated. And here's why I think that. So, you know, um, first of all, OpenAI obviously got a lot of attention for their virtual AI assistants that were almost getting to a place of being as convincing as like literally science fiction. Um, being able to just have a conversation, get tutoring, get help. Um, and so, we'll see what it looks like once it's actually released. And, I'm sure it's still rough around the edges. Um,
Mhm.
but fast forward 3, 4 years from now, I wouldn't, it seems pretty plausible that like this is going to be just everybody's going to have a version of an assistant in whatever job they do, right? If you're a teacher, you're
Absolutely.
going to have your teacher assistant, and you're not going to prompt engineer how, you're going to just like interact with them in the same way you interact with, someone on your team. You don't prompt
Right.
engineer with your EA, right? You just have a conversation, you figure out how to deliver feedback, and like, and
Right.
there will be there will be ways to do a better job, right, using it. In the same way that with Google search, most people know how to Google. It'd be kind of silly to say that like a search engineer would be like a differentiating skill, but there are people who are much, who know Boolean, search logic and can use Google a lot more effectively. And so I think there will be components like that. Um,
Yeah.
Other announcement that was even bigger in my view, but less talked about was Google at Google I/O, and it was kind of a simple demo. They basically were showcasing, agents in Android. So imagine like rather than ChatGPT, this is AI that can interpret your instructions, but actually use the apps on your phone. And so
Yeah.
the example they gave was they took a photo of a pair of shoes that they bought and said, "Hey, I want to return these shoes." The AI agent went into Gmail, found the order, filled out the return form, and scheduled a pickup. And that blew my mind because, what we're witnessing there is this is going to be the new way we interface with technology. Um, but if that's the new interface, then like, you know, teaching keyboarding is not a sufficient skill to succeed in the workforce. Like
Right.
you still might teach it. I think we should, right? Like, and so I think that is where this it's so important for us to actually like, try to close our eyes and imagine the future because 10 years is not it's a blink, if you're a freshman in high school, 10 years,
Yeah.
you're 2 years into your first job out of college.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
where we are in 10 years, it really does matter for what we're teaching kids in high school. And I think so much attention is focused on next year, 2 years from now. The tools that vendors are shilling today we're not going to be nobody's going to remember them 10 years from now.
Right,
Uh,
right,
it
right,
makes sense. Yeah,
right.
it's not to undersell. Like there's some really interesting use cases that are worth exploring. But
Absolutely. No, Alex, I really appreciate that because um, AI readiness is so foundational. Now, I loved how you phrased that. And I think that, when we talk about, specific competencies and skills, the readiness because of the evolution of the LLMs and the different AI tools. But I want to expand upon something and I asked you this question, Alex, in New York. And I don't know if you remember, and I'm going to continue to ask you this question because I think that this question needs to come up more as the expansion of generative tools as well as AI becomes, like I said, concretized in the education model is when we talk about, these LLMs, when we talk about machine learning, generative tools that we're incorporating into our class, we have to talk about representation of people that are designing these different tools and creating or putting these different algorithms together so that the front end experience is prompt engineering. But Alex, and I said this to you, I think we had a private conversation with this in New York, is that, we always talk about representation for teachers. We always talk about, ensuring that students are seeing themselves in leadership roles, in classroom dynamic roles. But, when I engage in these circles around, data scientists and psychometricians and AI engineers and machine learning engineers, it seems like I'm the only one from a or from, I like to say, a race aspect, and then also from a gender aspect. We don't see many women a part of these design conversations on the back end. If we want to ensure that our students are having this truly this inclusive learning experience in totality, how are we going to increase the representation of these machine learning engineers and these data scientists, as well as these psychometricians that are putting these algorithms together for front-end experiences with like a chat GPT 4.0 or any other type of generative tool that we're using? Because we want to ensure that there's that level of equity with the tools that we're using.
yeah, and you can even, just even the demos, you can kind of see the uh, uh the places that the people who came up with those ideas are coming from. Yeah, Silicon Valley is a bunch of white guys. What
I
else?
didn't say it. I didn't say
But this has been talked about for a long time, and there's a lot of folks in Silicon Valley who are very fast to beat the drum of like, we need to really focus on representation and tech. How are we going to do this? And there's been lots of initiatives, and to varying degrees of success. I mean, the big challenge is even if you figure the pipeline piece out, there's a culture issue, right? So like, it's tech companies are generally not welcoming environments because if you don't have other peers that you see yourself in that you can relate to, it becomes really hard to find a sense of belonging. So it's like it's really complicated.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
but one of the challenges is, you know, companies will sometimes say, well, we would love to hire more, diverse engineers, but when we look at the pool of applicants, there's just not enough of them. And so they're kind of, passing the buck off to uh, universities, and universities are saying, well, we'd love to bring more, diverse kids into our class, but all the kids who are signing up for computer science majors are guys.
Mhm.
Um, but then when you look at high school and you look at K-12, what you see is that computer science and STEM in general is opt-in. You have to you, the student, have to just, decide for yourself, like, this is what I want to do. This is something that's interesting to me. Or you have to be lucky enough to have parents who, know the world and are really like actively engaged in your education and sort of like nudging you there.
Right.
Um, and and we've simultaneously created a culture where, you know, opting into the CS or STEM thing, pathway, you're also buying into sort of like a certain stereotype, and
Yeah.
and so And that's really hard to pierce.
Yeah,
Uh, so our approach to this from, our mission isn't to address specifically representation of, diverse people building technology tools. It's obviously really important to the space generally. I think the work we do could is a component of it, but we just, like we're trying to stay as focused as possible, not sort of like uh,
absolutely.
not pretend that we're a silver bullet to everything. But I, when we think about access and equity to AI readiness, which I think is a precursor to all this,
Hmm.
um, that's why we were so focused on getting out of that opt-in track. Like you have to reach kids before they're being asked to like self-identify.
Absolutely.
Um, and I think there's a lot of kids who, if they had the opportunity to see what they could do in computer science or in robotics, and if we were really thoughtful about how to connect it with their own experience and their own the things they're excited about and make it culturally relevant. Um,
Yes.
and I think you'd reach more kids. And like that is, you know, like I think that's about as far back as we're gonna need to go. But at the same time, we have to make sure that when kids do opt in, that we're also being thoughtful about how to make them feel, welcome because like techies are not very good at being welcoming as even though they're trying harder. Um, so there's a lot of work to be done, but I would say like start as early as possible. And that's why sort of, I think that's one of the opportunities with AI literacy is we have a chance to rewrite the script. We computer science, you could throw billions of dollars at a marketing campaign around computer science. I think that ship has sailed. People have an assumption about what CS means.
Hmm.
Um, but AI is different. AI is art. AI is music. AI is, writing, and
Hmm.
it can be connected with politics and ethics, and so there's a lot of ways for us to reach kids where they are. um, but yeah, the one more statistic. I believe, and we should fact check this before the pod goes out, but I think it's something like less than, it's either 1% or even maybe 0.1%. It might be 0.1%. uh,
Wow.
I don't want to misstate the percentage of venture capitalists who are black.
Hmm. Hmm. Wow.
So if you're a black founder, 99% of the time you are going to be pitching to a bunch of white people, usually guys. Not always though, but
Yeah.
like that, I mean, like you don't need to know very much about social dynamics to understand like how the root of the problem is still so fundamental,
Yeah.
um, that we can fix the pipeline issue for kids, but if we don't address that, we're going to have a bunch of inspired, entrepreneurs who are being spit out of a system that is still, not, represent like where they're not represented.
Yeah.
So all hands on deck.
Yeah. And Alex, the reason I asked you this question is because I know that you are pushing this conversation and this level of intellectual rigor so that we can increase representation. And I really, truly appreciate that. And as one of the national voices in the ecosystem, I wanted to be able to elevate that voice on this platform to actually hear the conversation that you and I had, some of the stuff that we were talking about. But again, and I want to be able to highlight this too, Alex, is that, by 2026, 57% of education student demographics are going to be Black and brown. And then we're seeing, I believe roughly, and we have to be able to fact check this within the next 5 years, there will be an increase, 1 million jobs in computer science and roughly about 400,000 jobs in informational technology. So if we're seeing increase of the student demographics being much more diverse than any other time in history, and we also seeing an increase in computer science and informational technology jobs, I think there's that natural cross interfacing or that interfacing that we should see within the next 10 to 15 years, more representation in computer science and informational technology in the realm of AI, just purely on the stark quantitative statistics that we are seeing in education. But I want to expand upon something that you talked about, and this is referencing pathways, new pathways for CTE or industry preparation. for leaders and for school districts out there, for teachers, what are some of the new industry verticals or the new industry pathways districts should start focusing on to prepare our students for the future of work and future of the world?
Nobody knows. Yeah, nobody knows.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, you know, the
With that
CEOs.
grounded notion, Alex, that there is that the unknown and uncertainty of the future.
Well, but it's really hard. I mean, like I just had a retreat with my board, and the question I asked them all to answer is, you know, imagine a situation, because it happens to me all the time. Um, someone comes to you and they're like, "Hey, I have a 12-year-old daughter, 13-year-old son. They really want to go to law school. They want to become a doctor. They want to become an artist." And I'm reading the CEOs of the companies building these tools are saying that, software engineers aren't going to be that, they're going to be mass replaced by AI. Lawyers are going to be mass displaced by AI. What advice should I give my son or daughter? And I mean, so the hard thing is like we really don't know. We really, really don't know. It's the okay, so here's like there's a few different outcomes. I'm going to ignore the outcome where AI just becomes so powerful that it replaces all jobs, and we just have to figure out how we kind of like become basket makers and live life in a hammock. But the other two sort of like uh, uh, potential outcomes is um one where AI continues to develop and it unlocks all this productivity, and that creates new markets and businesses start to expand and roll things out, and they invest in and maybe with that and with all this sort of like generated content, there becomes a newfound value in the human connection. And so suddenly companies are massively building out, engagement and experience staff to like, that's how they differentiate, because everybody can just generate stuff like people are going to be paying for the personal touch. Um, and then the other outcome would be that maybe that eventually happens, but the displacement happens faster. But the challenge is in either case, we don't know where these people would be. We don't know which industries are more likely I mean, you can make some guess. I mean, like, so basically, if we're talking about knowledge work, broadly speaking, I think that it's really like, if it's one of those jobs that I mentioned earlier, all bets are off. If you're really trying to be like, if you're like, no, I need a job, I need a pathway, then I would say like, literally your best bet is plumber, electrician, carpenter, um, mechanic, um, working in semiconductors, like, and those aren't all white collar jobs. There's a lot of blue collar jobs and chip fabs, um, uh,
Yeah,
stuff like that, right? So, and those are high paying jobs. I mean, we're talking six figures. If you're
absolutely.
like a
Absolutely.
locksmith in a smaller town, there's the average age of a plumber is like 55. So these are like in demand industries. Healthcare, caregiving,
Yeah,
that's obviously so there's like some practical advice that you can give. Um,
yeah,
but this meta question for the people who's like, well, yeah, but my son wants to be a lawyer, or they want to be, a music producer. Then the answer is don't nobody should be pursuing a career pathway just because they think it's going to be the thing where they make money or have job security. There's a lot of people that went to law school not because they're like obsessed with the law and justice. It's just because it's like, hey, I want to make six figures. Lawyers are well paid. They drive BMWs, and that's the life I want. Um, but if you're not passionate about the law, I wouldn't point you in that direction, because what we need is for students to build those durable skills. We want them to like problem solve and build resilience and experiment and fail and try to start a sneaker business and, like, but they're going to do that in whatever domain they're actually passionate about.
yeah,
So it's follow your passion, but really focus on like, how do you build all those durable skills? Um, because and then probably like maybe the most important skill is actually like going to be getting a job. We
yeah,
might like it might be one of those things where the key differentiator is who is able to pivot. They get laid off. Their industry is actually starting to narrow.
yeah,
How do you set your kid up to seek out sort of like that credential that they get. Maybe there is sort of like that IT or maybe quantum, in a couple of years, there's maybe demand for like quantum technicians. And
Yeah.
so we need kids to be like good at getting jobs and not, and sort of like have the grit, to deal with change.
Yeah.
Hopefully that's
Alex,
like not too much of a cop out, but
love that, Alex. I love that answer because um, we can't commit, right? And I always been, this is kind of like this meta concept I've been informing people across the country, education stakeholders, is that, I like to say VUCA or Unweis. Unweis is uncertainty, volatile, intersectionality, complex, and exponential. That's the last Unweis, right? That we have to continue living in that world, but also the focus should be developing the skills of our students for this. I like to say, now, yes, college readiness. Yes, college readiness is important. College readiness is necessary. It is the primary design or the primary construct of how the education model is. But that AI readiness and career readiness intersection with those durable skills that you highlighted. Really appreciate that answer because, again, we don't know what the future is going to look like as we're seeing this evolution and revolution taking place within our economy. Last question, Alex. And I don't know if I can limit you to or I should say 3 words, but I'm going to try, right? We have some rule followers that, follow the rules with this question. Then we have, various guests who expand on the 3 words. So take it as it is, Alex. I'm not going to limit you, especially with my audience, to have you on BFB. But I'm going to say this. You forecasted the shifts with AI in education back in 2019. You called it. You called it. Now, what 3 words do you want our audience today to leave with regarding the new or predicted trends in the AC stage of education, which is after COVID?
Seamless,
Mm-hmm.
useful,
Mm-hmm.
and ubiquitous. It's gonna be everywhere.
Now, I'm going to ask you to break the rules. Can you expand on seamless, useful, and ubiquitous?
Yeah, seamless because I think 5, 10 years from now, we're gonna look back at these conversations and it's gonna be so quaint.
Mm-hmm.
We're gonna AI is gonna be so it's gonna be part of literally everything.
Mm-hmm.
The same way that we the internet and our doorbells and our like that, like it's going to be that level of just like, of course,
Yeah.
useful because I really think this is going to be it, once AI can do something like uh, fill out a really long, annoying spreadsheet that would take you 3 hours,
Right.
like not gonna do it. Like you're not gonna just fill the spreadsheet out on principle because, well, I don't think AI is should be doing, like you're just gonna lean on it. Like nobody fills out written spreadsheets anymore. Like literally zero people do that. Um, and so because it's useful, it will be um, it sort of irrevocable
Mm-hmm.
and, and ubiquitous, I guess. Yeah, because it's going to be everywhere, and I think it's also going to surprise people. Um, People may think that this doesn't concern them, but in many ways, but at least several ways, it's going to touch them really closely in their lives. Whether that's work, but it could also be their, socially, or their kids, or their grandmother.
Absolutely. And Alex, I'll tell you this, when I start hearing my mother talking about Chat GPT, it kind of scares me, Alex. It really does. But you're so right. And I hope that, the vision and from a reverse engineering standpoint too, with the design of our new education model, that it becomes seamless, extremely useful to close specific access and opportunity gaps, and obviously ubiquitous in the context of how it is integrated into our operating model for new value capture and value creation. Alex Kotran, thank you so much for being on VFV now with aiEDU. If any of my audience members or people that are viewing today through YouTube, if they want to just find out what aiEDU is about, to be able to join the coalition, how would they be able to do that, Alex?
Yeah, AIEDU.org.
That simple. Alex, I will see you in the middle of June
All right.
at the
Good. Yeah,
event in New York City. It was so good to have you on VFP, my friend.
Dr. Connor, thank you so much.
Absolutely. And on that note, onward and upward, everybody. Have a great evening.